What does it take to become a legend, not just in stories or songs, but in the brutal reality of war, where every decision could mean victory or annihilation? The 100 Years' War was a stage for some of history's most astonishing acts of bravery, where warriors didn't just fight battles, they defined an era. From Joan of Arc's unwavering faith to the Black Prince's tactical genius, these were moments where ordinary men and women became immortal through sheer will. And today, we're counting down 25 of the most heroic acts that shaped this epic conflict. These aren't just tales of swords and sieges, they're about the unbreakable spirit that turns the tide of history. By the time we're done, you'll see these warriors not as distant figures, but as living proof of what courage can achieve. So ready your curiosity, because history is about to come alive. Imagine a conflict so sprawling it stretched across multiple generations, where kings rose and fell, borders shifted like sand, and the very future of two mighty nations hung in the balance. The 100 Years' War wasn't a single clash, but a relentless chess game played out over 116 years, where every move had consequences echoing far beyond the battlefield. At its heart, this was a story of ambitious English kings clinging to ancient claims over French lands, while French rulers fought to unite their fractured kingdom under one crown. But it wasn't just about territory, it was about identity. The war birthed new forms of warfare, from the devastating power of the English longbow to the rise of professional armies that forever changed how nations fought. And in this crucible of chaos, ordinary individuals, knights, peasants, even a teenage girl stepped into history's spotlight. Their actions didn't just shape battles, they shaped the very idea of what it meant to be a hero. So before we dive into those 25 legendary acts, remember, these weren't isolated feats of bravery. They were sparks that ignited in a world where every decision could tip the scales of an entire century. The year was 1356, and the fields near Poitiers bore witness to a moment that would shake the foundations of medieval warfare. Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, stood with his weary English forces, staring down a French army nearly twice their size. This wasn't just a battle, it was a desperate gambit that would test the limits of strategy and courage. While most commanders would have relied on cavalry charges, Edward made a radical choice. He ordered his knights to dismount, forming a defensive line alongside his longbowmen. This wasn't just defiance, it was tactical brilliance. The French, confident in their numerical advantage, hurled wave after wave of armored knights forward, only to be met with a storm of arrows that darkened the sky. Chaos erupted as horses faltered and formations collapsed, but the Black Prince's men held firm. Then came the masterstroke, a sudden counterattack that shattered the French lines and led to an unthinkable prize, the capture of King John II himself. This victory didn't just secure Edward's reputation, it proved that adaptability could triumph over tradition, rewriting the rules of war in real time. Poitiers became more than a battlefield, it was the moment the future of warfare tilted on its axis. By the spring of 1429, France stood on the brink. The English siege of Orléans had dragged on for months, strangling the city's defenses and morale until an unlikely figure emerged from the countryside. Joan of Arc was just 17, a peasant girl with no military training, yet she carried something more powerful than any sword, an unshakable belief in her divine mission. When she arrived at the French court, many dismissed her as a madwoman or worse, but Joan's conviction cut through the doubt like sunlight through fog. Clad in white armor and bearing a banner painted with angels, she rode to Orléans not as a soldier but as a symbol. What happened next defied all logic. Under her leadership, French troops launched a series of bold assaults that shattered English strongholds. Joan didn't just direct battles from the rear, she fought in the thick of it, taking an arrow to the shoulder during one attack but refusing to retreat. Her presence electrified the exhausted defenders, and within days the siege collapsed. This wasn't merely a military victory, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time in years, the French remembered what it felt like to win, and the English began to question their invincibility. Joan proved that courage isn't measured by age, rank, or gender, but by the strength of one's conviction. Orléans became the spark that would eventually light France's path to reunification, all because a teenage girl dared to believe she could change history. Cold rain fell relentlessly on the muddy fields of Agincourt in October 1415, turning the ground into a treacherous quagmire where history would soon pivot. King Henry V's army, exhausted, starving, and ravaged by dysentery, faced a French force that outnumbered them nearly 5-1. Most military leaders would have seen retreat as the only option. But Henry understood something deeper. That victory wasn't just about numbers, it was about the fire in men's hearts. As dawn approached, he didn't rally his troops with threats or promises of loot. Instead, he spoke of honor, of legacy, of how future generations would remember their courage on this day. His words, later immortalized by Shakespeare but no less powerful in their original moment, cut through the fear like a torch in the darkness. "We few, we happy few," he declared, binding his men together not as subjects but as brothers in arms. And when the battle began, it wasn't just English longbows that won the day, it was the unbreakable spirit Henry had ignited. The French knights, weighed down by armor, struggled helplessly in the mud as arrows rained down, their charge collapsing into chaos. By afternoon, the field belonged to Henry's band of brothers, their victory so complete it stunned all of Europe. Agincourt became more than a battle. It was proof that leadership could turn even the direst odds into triumph, and at its core stood a king who knew that the right words, spoken at the right moment, could echo across centuries. Bertrand du Guesclin didn't fight like other knights. While noblemen clashed in glittering armor on open fields, this grizzled warrior from Brittany preferred shadows and surprise. His face weathered by decades of conflict, Du Guesclin understood something his enemies didn't: that wars aren't always won by brute strength, but by wearing down an opponent's will. Dubbed the Eagle of Brittany for his relentless strikes, he turned the countryside into a weapon. Roads became death traps, forests hid ambushes, and every English supply convoy risked vanishing into thin air. Du Guesclin's greatest strength wasn't his sword arm, it was his patience. He knew France needed time to recover from years of defeat, so he bled the English drop by drop, never engaging in pitched battles unless the odds favored him. But his defining moment came not on the battlefield but in captivity. When captured and offered freedom in exchange for renouncing his loyalty to France, he spat out his refusal. Even as his ransom drained the royal treasury, he stood firm, proving his word was stronger than chains. This was heroism redefined, not just courage under fire, but the stubborn resolve to uphold honor when no one was watching. Du Guesclin's legacy wasn't just in the territories he reclaimed, but in the lesson he taught, that sometimes the sharpest weapon is an unbreakable spirit. La Roche-Derrien was supposed to fall. That's what the French commanders believed in 1347 when they surrounded the small Breton town with an army dwarfing its defenders. Inside the walls stood Sir Thomas Dagworth and his modest English garrison, outnumbered, outgunned, but far from outwitted. While conventional wisdom dictated fortifying the town and waiting for siege engines to pound the defenses into dust, Dagworth flipped the script entirely. He turned the very landscape into his ally, exploiting the narrow streets and cramped alleys where the French numbers meant nothing. But his real genius came under cover of darkness. Night after night, he launched lightning raids, small bands of men slipping through the shadows, striking supply lines, torching siege equipment, then vanishing before the French could rally. Each attack was a pinprick, but collectively they bled the enemy dry. Sleep became a luxury the French couldn't afford. their morale fraying with every false alarm and sudden skirmish. By the time English reinforcements finally arrived, the once confident besiegers were exhausted shadows of their former selves. The relief force didn't just break the siege, they shattered it, sending the French fleeing in disarray. Dagworth's victory wasn't just about holding ground, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He proved that a clever mind could multiply the strength of a few hundred into an army's worth of trouble, rewriting the rules of siegecraft in the process. La Roche-Derrien became a warning to every overconfident commander. Never underestimate the power of a defender who fights smarter, not harder. Starvation had reduced Calais to a city of ghosts by the summer of 1347. The once proud port, now encircled by English forces for nearly a year, saw its streets lined with hollow-eyed citizens scraping bark from trees for food. Yet within those crumbling walls stood Jean de Vienne, a commander faced with an impossible choice: surrender his people or watch them perish. But this wasn't just about tactics, it was about the soul of knighthood itself. When the end came, de Vienne didn't slink out under cover of darkness. He rode through the gates in full armor, his dignity untouched by hunger or defeat, and presented his sword to King Edward III with a challenge that silenced the victorious camp. If honor cannot be won, he declared, let it at least be preserved. Edward, expecting a broken man, found instead a rival who elevated the moment into legend. The king's own chroniclers would later write that de Vienne's unbroken spirit shamed the English court into mercy, sparing the citizens from slaughter. Here was the paradox of chivalry laid bare: a man who lost the battle but won the greater war of reputation. His stand at Calais became a beacon for generations of warriors, proving that true heroism isn't measured in victories alone, but in the grace with which one bears the weight of defeat. The frozen ground of Lussac crackled underfoot in January 1370 as two legendary warriors circled each other, not in massed combat, but in a duel that would define the very essence of chivalry. Sir John Shandos, the white-haired English knight whose strategies had shaped battles across France, now faced Jean de Grailly in single combat. This wasn't just a clash of blades, it was a collision of ideals. Both men knew each other by reputation, both had commanded thousands, yet here they stood alone, stripped of armies, reduced to nothing but skill and honor. Shandos, though past his prime, moved with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime mastering the dance of steel. But fate played a cruel trick. His footing betrayed him on the icy terrain, sending him sprawling as de Grailly's sword found its mark. Blood seeped through Shandos' armor, yet what happened next stunned onlookers. Instead of delivering the killing blow, de Grailly hesitated. In that suspended moment, something extraordinary passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared valor. The French commander refused to strike again, ordering his own physicians to tend his rival's wounds. Shandos would die days later, but not before this act of mercy became legend. Here was warfare stripped of politics, revealing its beating heart, that even in conflict, respect could transcend vengeance. Their duel became a torch held high in the darkest hours of war, proving that true honor wasn't about winning, but about recognizing greatness in your foe. Centuries later, we remember not who lived or died that day, but how two enemies reminded the world that nobility isn't worn on a sash, it's etched in choices. September 25, 1396. The fields outside Nicopolis ran red with the blood of knights who knew they rode to their doom. Though the crusade against the Ottomans lay beyond the borders of France, the battle carried the echoes of the 100 Years' War in the armor of its warriors. Among them stood the flower of Burgundian chivalry, men who had learned war in the long struggle between England and France. When the Ottoman forces trapped their Hungarian allies in a deadly crescent of steel, these knights faced a choice no soldier ever wants to make: retreat to fight another day, or charge into certain death to buy time for comrades. What happened next wasn't strategy, it was raw humanity. Without hesitation, they lowered their lances and spurred forward, a thunderous wave of steel and resolve crashing against impossible odds. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of how their banners dipped one by one like candles guttering in the wind, each fall marking another life given freely. Their sacrifice bought precious hours for thousands to escape, transforming what could have been a massacre into a legend. Nicopolis became more than a defeat. It was a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in the fires of the 100 Years' War, proving that the truest measure of courage isn't victory, but the willingness to stand when all hope is gone. These knights carried the spirit of that conflict to distant lands, showing that heroism knows no borders. Robert Knowles didn't need grand battles to leave his mark on history. In 1355, as English and French forces clashed across Normandy, this seasoned commander devised a strategy so ruthless it redefined the art of war. While others sought glory in head-on clashes, Knowles understood something more profound. That victory could be carved not just with swords but with fear. His great chevauchée, a word that barely captures the scope of his campaign, wasn't about holding territory. It was about sending an unmistakable message. With a force of hardened men-at-arms and longbowmen, he swept through the French countryside like a shadow, striking deep behind enemy lines. Villages burned, supply routes vanished, and word spread faster than the flames. Nowhere was safe. But here's what made Knowles different. He wasn't mindlessly destructive. Each raid was calculated, targeting regions loyal to the French crown while sparing lands that might switch allegiances. The psychological toll was devastating. French nobles, unable to protect their people, saw their authority crumble as panic spread through the ranks. Even the mightiest castles became useless when the real war was happening in the minds of those who lived in their shadow. Knowles proved that war wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was waged in the whispers of terrified peasants, the hesitation of local garrisons, and the growing doubt of kings. His chevauchée left no monuments, but its impact echoed through every French strategy meeting, forcing commanders to scatter their forces in futile defense. Sometimes the sharpest blade is the one never drawn, just feared. Harfleur's walls trembled under the relentless pounding of English trebuchets in August 1415, but the men inside stood firm. This wasn't just another siege, it was a battle against time itself. While Henry V's army unleashed wave after wave of assaults, the French garrison did something extraordinary. They turned their port town into a labyrinth of resistance. Every street became a killing zone, every house a stronghold. For 5 grueling weeks, they weathered storms of arrows, tunneling countermines to collapse English siegeworks from below, while disease and dysentery crept through both armies like invisible enemies. The defenders knew they couldn't hold forever, yet they also understood the deeper game at play. Each day they delayed Henry's advance meant shorter supplies and longer marches for the English as winter loomed. Their commander, Raoul de Gaucourt, didn't just fight with swords. He fought with calendars, dragging out negotiations to buy precious hours even as his men grew gaunt from hunger. When surrender finally came, it wasn't weakness that forced their hand. It was mathematics. With barely a third of their number left standing, they'd already achieved the impossible, forcing the legendary Henry to spend a third of his campaign season on a single town. The English king would march away from Harfleur with a hollow victory, his army decimated by sickness, his timetable in ruins. Sometimes heroism isn't about winning, it's about making the enemy pay for every inch of ground. Those shattered walls stood as silent witness to a truth every conqueror learns too late, that the fiercest resistance often leaves no monuments, only ghosts. They called themselves the Companions of Joan, not soldiers bound by feudal oaths, but warriors united by something far stronger, belief. Men like Etienne de Vignoles, better known as La Hire, a grizzled mercenary who'd spent his life fighting for gold until Joan's presence turned his sword into a sacred instrument. Then there was Gilles de Rais, the brilliant young knight whose wealth could have bought him safety, yet chose instead to empty his coffers funding Joan's campaign. What transformed these hardened fighters into disciples wasn't blind obedience. It was witnessing the impossible made real through her actions. When Joan stood unscathed amidst volleys of arrows at Orléans, when she predicted battlefield outcomes with eerie precision, even seasoned warriors saw more than strategy at work. La Hire, whose profanity was so notorious that Joan supposedly allowed him one prayer, God, do what La Hire would do if you were La Hire and he was God, became her fiercest protector, leading charges with a berserker gang fury that sent enemies fleeing. Gilles, though later stained by infamy, in those days fought like a man possessed, his once polished armor battered from constant combat. Their heroism wasn't born of duty, but from seeing the divine reflected in a peasant girl's unshakable certainty. When Joan fell wounded at Les Tourelles, it was these men who formed a human wall, buying time for her recovery despite impossible odds. They didn't just follow Joan, they became extensions of her will, proving that true leadership ignites not through commands, but by awakening something transcendent in those who bear witness. The Companions' legacy reminds us that the greatest battles are often won not by armies, but by the spark one soul can kindle in many. Limoges burned in the autumn of 1370, its walls breached, its streets choked with smoke, yet amidst the carnage, an unexpected order rang out. Edward the Black Prince, his body already ravaged by illness that would soon end his career, made a decision that defied the conventions of his time. As his soldiers surged through the shattered gates, he commanded them to spare the women and children huddled in terror. In an age where besieged cities often faced total annihilation, this act of restraint wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. The sack of Limoges had been brutal by necessity, punishing the bishop's betrayal after he surrendered the city to the French. But something in Edward stirred when confronted with innocent lives caught in the machinery of war. Chroniclers would later debate his motivations. Was it chivalry, piety, or the shadow of his own mortality? What mattered wasn't the why, but the seismic shift it represented. Here was a warrior who'd built his legend on the fields of Poitiers, now proving that true strength could also mean mercy. His men, hardened by years of campaigning, obeyed without question, shepherding the terrified civilians to safety even as they pressed their attack against armed defenders. This single decision peeled back the layers of medieval warfare to reveal an enduring truth that even in darkness, light persists. The Black Prince's legacy at Limoges wasn't carved in stone or celebrated in songs, but etched in the lives he chose not to take, reminding us that the measure of a warrior isn't just in battles won, but in humanity preserved. The waves off Sluys churned crimson on June 24, 1340, as two of medieval Europe's mightiest fleets locked in a struggle that would redefine naval warfare. Edward III didn't just command ships, he unleashed floating fortresses, transforming the English Channel into a killing ground where traditional rules of engagement no longer applied. The French outnumbered his forces nearly 2-1, their vessels towering over his own, but Edward saw opportunity where others saw certain defeat. Instead of conventional ship-to-ship combat, he ordered his archers to rain down arrows while grappling hooks turned enemy decks into battlegrounds where English men-at-arms could fight as if on solid ground. The French advantage in ship size became their undoing. Their crowded decks made perfect targets for volleys of English longbow fire, while their inability to maneuver trapped them like fish in a net. By dusk, the once proud French fleet lay broken, its survivors leaping into waters already choked with the dead. What made Sluys extraordinary wasn't just the scale of victory, it was how Edward proved that true military genius adapts to any terrain. For generations, French cross-channel raids had tormented English coasts, but after this single cataclysmic engagement, those threats evaporated. The psychological impact rippled farther than any arrow's flight. Suddenly, England wasn't just defending its shores, it controlled the very highways of war. Sluys became the moment Europe learned that mastery of land meant nothing without command of the waves, and Edward's name echoed across every royal court from Paris to Genoa as the ruler who turned the sea itself into his weapon. The French knights at Agincourt knew the odds were impossible. Their armor weighed them down like drowned men as they struggled through knee-deep mud, their war horses floundering under a sky dark with English arrows. Yet still they came not once, not twice, but in wave after wave of increasingly desperate charges. What drove these men forward wasn't blind obedience or even hope of victory. It was something deeper, the unspoken code of their class. To turn back would stain their honor far worse than any battlefield defeat. So they pressed on, their banners growing heavier with rain and blood, their ranks thinning with every grueling step toward the English lines. Contemporary accounts describe how their plate armor rang like discordant bells under the relentless barrage, some knights so immobilized by the sodden earth that English men-at-arms could walk up and dispatch them at leisure. Yet even then, the survivors refused to yield. Some broke swords against helmets in final acts of defiance. Others died trying to pull comrades from the mire. Their sacrifice became the dark mirror to Henry's triumph, proof that courage alone couldn't overcome disastrous tactics, but also that some warriors would rather perish than betray their idea of themselves. Long after the battle faded from living memory, the last charge endured as both warning and tribute, a reminder that the noblest intentions can lead to tragedy, but also that there's a terrible beauty in refusal to surrender when all else is lost. These knights didn't just die at Agincourt, they defined the limits of an entire era's understanding of valor. They had no suits of armor, no trained knights, just desperation and the unshakable will to protect what was theirs. When Edward III's army appeared outside Rhimes in 1359, the English king expected another docile surrender. After all, what could shopkeepers, bakers, and blacksmiths do against professional soldiers? But the people of Rhimes answered that question with every cobblestone they pried from the streets, every boiling pot of oil they hauled onto the ramparts. This wasn't just a siege, it was a revolution in the making. While French nobility scrambled to regroup after years of defeats, these everyday citizens turned their city into a fortress of ingenuity. Women melted down household tools to forge arrowheads, children stacked furniture to block breached gates, and elderly monks, armed with nothing but farming tools, stood shoulder to shoulder with young apprentices at the weakest points in the walls. Edward's siege engines pounded relentlessly, but each assault met with a hailstorm of improvised missiles, roof tiles, shattered pottery, even beehives hurled like living grenades. The true turning point came under cover of a moonless night, when a daring band of leatherworkers and masons slipped through enemy lines to torch the English supply wagons. Flames lit the sky as weeks of carefully stockpiled provisions vanished in smoke, leaving Edward's forces starving and demoralized. By the time he ordered the retreat, Rhimes had proven something profound, that the spirit of resistance could transform ordinary hands into weapons strong enough to humble kings. Their victory echoed far beyond those battered walls, whispering a truth that would haunt every future invader: never underestimate those fighting for home. Blood ties and battlefields don't always align, a truth Owain Lawgoc knew better than most. This Welsh prince by blood but mercenary by trade carried a legacy heavier than any sword: the name of Llewellyn the Last, the ruler whose death had sealed Wales' conquest by England a century earlier. When he raised his banner in 1372, it wasn't for gold or glory, but for something far more personal. France saw in him a weapon to strike at England's vulnerable underbelly. Owain saw a chance to settle an ancient score. His campaigns along the Breton coast became masterclasses in asymmetrical warfare, hitting coastal towns with lightning raids, then vanishing into the countryside before English reinforcements could arrive. But his most daring move came when he nearly captured the castle of Mortagny-sur-Gironde, planting the Red Dragon flag of Wales on French soil as both provocation and promise. Contemporary chronicles describe how English soldiers recoiled at the sight, as if the ghosts of their ancestors whispered warnings across the centuries. What made Owain extraordinary wasn't just his tactical skill, it was how he weaponized memory itself. Every burned supply depot, every intercepted messenger, served as a reminder that England's conquests weren't as secure as they seemed. Though he'd never set foot in his homeland, his very existence became a living challenge to English rule, proving that loyalty isn't always bound by borders. Sometimes it's written in the fire of unfinished revolutions. His final act came not on the battlefield, but in an assassin's shadow betrayed by a fellow Welshman paid with English gold. Even in death, he embodied the painful duality of his life, a prince without a kingdom, whose greatest victory was making oppressors look over their shoulders. A prison cell should have been the perfect place to break a king's spirit, but Charles II of Navarre was never one to play by the rules. Captured by the English after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, this cunning ruler found himself locked away far from his Pyrenean kingdom, with enemies eager to keep him out of the war permanently. Yet what his captors underestimated was Charles' most dangerous weapon, his mind. While other nobles languished in captivity awaiting ransom, the so-called Bad King orchestrated an escape worthy of legend. Disguising himself as a humble merchant, right down to the worn clothing and dirt smudged across his face, he didn't just slip past guards, he convinced them to help carry his goods through the gates. The sheer audacity of it left contemporaries torn between outrage and admiration. Here was a man who turned his very reputation for deceit into an asset, weaponizing expectations against those who thought they held him powerless. His jailers had assumed a monarch would cling to dignity, refusing to stoop to common disguises, but Charles understood true power lies in adaptability. By the time his absence was discovered, he was already halfway to Paris, where his sudden reappearance sent shockwaves through both English and French courts. This wasn't swords and Darrow's heroism. It was the kind of cunning that redefined what victory looked like in an era obsessed with battlefield glory. Charles proved that sometimes the sharpest blade is the one no one sees coming, and that escaping a cage can be as transformative as winning a war. They sailed into history not under any king's banner, but under the promise of gold and a chance to carve their names into legend. The Free Companies, bands like the infamous White Company, were the wild cards of the 100 Years' War, mercenaries whose loyalty shifted with the tides of profit and survival. To nobility, they were disposable blades for hire. To peasants, they were nightmares made flesh. Yet within their ranks flourished a kind of raw, unpolished heroism the chroniclers often ignored. Take John Hawkwood, the Englishman who rose from peasant stock to command the White Company, turning a ragtag band of ex-soldiers and fortune-seekers into the most feared fighting force in Italy. His genius wasn't in chivalrous charges, but in something far more practical. He taught his men to move like ghosts, striking at dawn when enemies were groggy with sleep, then melting back into the landscape before retaliation could come. Their signature tactic, dismounting their men at arms to fight on foot alongside archers, creating mobile death traps that could pivot on a moment's notice. But the Free Company's true legacy wasn't just their brutality, it was how they exposed the hypocrisy of medieval warfare. While nobles preached honor, these mercenaries lived by a simpler code: adaptability or die. When the White Company found themselves stranded without supplies outside Milan, they didn't starve. They negotiated passage by threatening to burn every vineyard in Lombardy unless paid to leave. Ruthless, absolutely; effective, undeniably. What made them heroic wasn't their morals, but their relentless will to survive against all odds, proving that even in war's darkest corners, ingenuity could flourish. Their stories remind us that history isn't just written by the victors sometimes, it's scrawled in the margins by those who refuse to play by anyone's rules but their own. When the gates of Hennebont shuddered under enemy assault in 1342, Countess Jean de Montfort didn't barricade herself in the keep. She strapped on armor and led the counterattack herself. While chroniclers of her time often reduced women to passive victims or political pawns, the siege laid bare a different truth, that medieval warfare had no gender lines when survival was at stake. Jean's legend wasn't just born from her sword arm, though she wielded one with terrifying skill, but from her genius for turning weakness into strength. With her husband imprisoned by the French, she transformed a city on the brink into a fortress of defiance, rallying townsfolk with speeches that mixed fire and faith. But her masterstroke came when she noticed the enemy's camp lying nearly undefended during an assault. Seizing the moment, she led 300 mounted townspeople, many of them women dressed as men, in a lightning raid that torched the besiegers' supplies. The astonished French called her the Flame afterward, not just for the fires she set, but for the unquenchable spirit that outmaneuvered them at every turn. Yet for every Jean, there were countless unnamed heroines whose deeds vanished into the margins of history. Imagine the sheer audacity of the women of Rhimes in 1356, who poured boiling oil through murder holes onto scaling ladders, their hands steady despite the screams below. Or the laundresses of Tournai, who smuggled messages through enemy lines in bundles of clothing, their mundane chores becoming lifelines for the besieged. These weren't exceptions, they were the quiet backbone of resistance. In an age where chroniclers rarely recorded a woman's name unless she was royalty, siege accounts tell a different story through fleeting details. The baker's wife who organized food rationing to stretch supplies, the blacksmith's daughter who repaired armor by candlelight while arrows rattled against the shutters. What made their heroism extraordinary wasn't just courage under fire, it was how they redefined the very tools of war. A cauldron meant for soup became a weapon, a needle meant for embroidery stitched wounds closed under bombardment. These women fought not for glory, but for something more visceral, the child hiding in the cellar, the neighbor too old to lift a pitchfork. Their legacy whispers through the centuries, reminding us that the truest measure of defiance isn't always in the clash of steel. Sometimes it's in the hands that refuse to stop working, the voices that refuse to stop singing hymns atop the walls as the trebuchets creak under their deadly loads. The chaos of Crécy's battlefield in August 1346 had reached its fever pitch, arrows darkening the skies, knights in shining armor stumbling through muddy fields, and the deafening cries of men who knew this day would be their last. Amidst that carnage stood an unnamed English longbowman, his fingers calloused from years of pulling new strings, his stance steady despite the madness around him. He couldn't have known his next shot would ripple through history. When King John of Bohemia, a blind monarch who'd insisted on being led into battle so he could strike one final blow, entered the fray, the archer's arrow found its mark with chilling precision. The legend claims it was that single shot that sealed the king's fate, piercing through the chaos to strike down a ruler who embodied the fading ideals of chivalry. But this wasn't just about one man's aim, it was about the seismic shift it represented. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by noble knights clad in steel, their names etched into chronicles while common soldiers faded into obscurity. Crécy turned that hierarchy on its head. That anonymous archer, standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands like him, proved that a peasant's skill could topple kings. His arrow became more than a weapon, it was a symbol of democracy in destruction, a reminder that history isn't always written by the elite, but sometimes by the hands of those history never bothers to name. The lesson echoed far beyond the battlefield. In this new era of war, courage alone wasn't enough. Adaptation was everything, and the longbow, a humble weapon wielded by ordinary men, had just rewritten the rules of power. The battlefield of diplomacy required no swords, yet its victories could shape nations just as profoundly, and no one proved this more strikingly than Isabella of France. While warriors clashed across the countryside, this formidable queen, often called the she-wolf for her tenacity, orchestrated a different kind of heroism from the shadows of the negotiating table. The year was 1360, and after decades of bloodshed, both England and France teetered on the brink of exhaustion. Isabella recognized what warmongers refused to acknowledge, that sometimes the boldest act isn't pressing forward but knowing when to pause. The Treaty of Bretigny wasn't just ink on parchment, it was a masterstroke of strategy disguised as compromise. She leveraged England's fleeting advantage and France's desperate need for respite into terms that temporarily halted the war while preserving her kingdom's future options. What made Isabella's achievement extraordinary wasn't just the treaty itself, but how she outmaneuvered expectations at every turn. Male chroniclers of her time often dismissed women's political roles, yet here she was, dismantling decades of hostility with nothing but words and unwavering resolve. Behind closed doors, she played rival factions like chess pieces, appealing to Edward III's desire for legitimacy while ensuring her son, the future Charles V, retained enough sovereignty to rebuild. The truce held for 9 fragile years, a breathing space France desperately needed to reorganize its armies and finances. Historians still debate whether Isabella acted out of maternal instinct, royal duty, or sheer genius, but the impact was undeniable. Her negotiations bought time for France to cultivate leaders like Bertrand du Guesclin, who would later turn the tide of war. This was heroism redefined, not the flash of blades, but the quiet patience of a diplomat who understood that wars are won as much in council chambers as on battlefields. Isabella's legacy whispers a truth we often forget, that the pen can be mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by someone who knows how to make peace as strategic as war. Jean de Bourbon's armor still bore the dents of Agincourt when he knelt before the Dauphin 14 years later, a man caught between two worlds. His capture in that muddy slaughter had been swift, dragged from his fallen horse under a sky black with arrows, his noble title meaningless in the chaos. Years in English captivity had stripped him of everything but his name, yet when freedom finally came, he faced an agonizing choice. Many French nobles had sworn oaths to Henry V during their imprisonment, trading loyalty for release. Bourbon could have kept his head down, returned to his estates, and let the tides of war wash past him. Instead, he rode straight to the court of Charles VII, not to beg forgiveness, but to demand a place in the fight he'd left unfinished. The Dauphin's advisors whispered treason. How could a man who'd broken bread with the enemy be trusted? But Charles saw something deeper in Bourbon's weary eyes, not just a prisoner returning home, but a living testament to France's resilience. When given command of troops at the Siege of Meaux in 1422, Bourbon fought with the desperation of a man redeeming his soul. Witnesses wrote of how he led assaults without armor, as if daring fate to finish what Agincourt had started. Yet this wasn't mere recklessness, it was strategy forged in the crucible of captivity. He'd studied English tactics not as an outsider, but as one forced to share their firesides, learning their weaknesses from the inside. His greatest moment came not with a sword, but with a smuggled message, exploiting old connections among his former jailers to orchestrate a gate's midnight opening. Bourbon's story cuts to the heart of the 100 Years' War's bitter paradox that loyalty could bend without breaking, and honor might wear many disguises. Where others saw betrayal, he proved that true allegiance isn't about never falling, but about how one rises after the fall. His redemption wasn't just personal. It mirrored France's own slow climb from the abyss of Agincourt, a reminder that even the longest nights end when someone refuses to stop lighting torches. Amidst the clangor of battle, another kind of hero emerged, one whose weapon was not steel but ink, Christine de Pizan sat in her candlelit study, surrounded by the wreckage of war-torn France, and did something revolutionary. She picked up a quill. While knights measured glory in captured castles, this remarkable woman understood that true immortality lay in preserving their stories. Her writings weren't mere chronicles. They were lifelines thrown across centuries, ensuring that the sacrifices of warriors like Joan of Arc and Bertrand du Guesclin would never fade into silence. What made Christine extraordinary wasn't just her eloquence, it was her audacity. In an age when women's voices were often confined to domestic spheres, she commanded the attention of kings and generals, her words shaping how history would remember this brutal conflict. When she wrote of the Siege of Orléans, she didn't just list tactics. She painted the fear in young soldiers' eyes, the way dawn light glinted off Joan's armor, transforming dry facts into a tapestry of human resilience. But her genius went deeper. She recognized that wars are won as much in hearts as on battlefields. Her treatises on chivalry subtly challenged leaders to live up to the ideals they preached, proving that a scholar's quiet critique could sway policy as powerfully as any sword. Yet Christine wasn't alone. Forgotten scribes in monastery scriptoria worked tirelessly, their hands cramping as they copied letters by flickering candlelight. Anonymous ballad singers wandered from village to village, turning bloody skirmishes into songs that bound communities together with shared memory. Even enemy clerks like English chronicler Jean Froissart became unlikely heroes of preservation. His detailed accounts, though biased, ensured that French perspectives weren't erased by Victor's narratives. These keeper of stories understood something profound, that history isn't just what happens, it's what survives. While castles crumbled and banners frayed, their parchment endured, carrying forward not only the grand strategies of kings but the quiet courage of common soldiers whose names would otherwise be lost. In their ink-stained hands, the 100 Years' War became more than a series of battles. It became a testament to the unbreakable human spirit, written in a language that time itself couldn't erase. History books glitter with the names of kings and knights, but the real weight of war was carried on the shoulders of men who never saw their names in ink. Picture the mud-caked archer at Agincourt, fingers numb as he knocked another arrow despite the blood seeping through his glove. Consider the nameless pikeman at Poitiers who locked shields with strangers to form a wall against armored knights, knowing he'd likely never see home again. These weren't just faceless crowds, they were fathers who'd kissed their children goodbye. Farmers who knew more about plowshares than poleaxes, yet stood firm when the trumpets sounded. What makes their sacrifice heroic isn't just the dying, it's the choosing. When disease-riddled garrisons at Calais ate rats rather than surrender, when exhausted longbowmen at Crécy fired until their fingertips split open, they weren't fighting for glory or land. They fought for the man beside them, for the promise of a sunrise they might never see. Modern archaeology tells their stories in silent eloquence. A skeleton in Burgundy with arrowheads fused to its ribs from some forgotten skirmish. A rusted medallion of the Virgin Mary clutched in the dirt where a soldier fell mid-prayer. The truest monument to these unknown warriors isn't carved in stone. It's in the very fabric of history they shaped. Every legendary charge by kings relied on hundreds of anonymous hands holding the line. Every siege broken began with some farmer's son hauling stones to patch a breach under hails of arrows. Their collective courage created the foundation upon which Joan of Arc could rally, Henry V could triumph, and France could slowly rise from the ashes. To forget them is to miss the heart of war's paradox, that its grandest tales are woven from threads of ordinary lives, quietly severed. When we speak of heroism in the 100 Years' War, let the last word belong not to the famous, but to the countless who whispered, "I will," when fate demanded everything. The smoke had barely cleared from Castillon's battlefield in July 1453, when the world realized something profound had shifted, not just in the fortunes of war, but in the very fabric of Europe itself. This wasn't merely the last gasp of a century-long conflict. It was the birth cry of nations as we know them. The French victory here, forged by reformed armies and artillery masterminds like Jean Bureau, did more than expel the English from Aquitaine. It shattered the old feudal order where a king could claim foreign thrones through ancestral parchment. What emerged from the rubble was something radically new. The idea that a people's identity could be tied to the land they bled for, not just the lord they served. Consider the transformation. Before the war, soldiers fought for personal loyalty to a duke or count. By Castillon, they marched under banners that symbolized something larger, France or England as living entities. The longbowmen who once followed Edward III for plunder now stood as defenders of English soil, while French peasants who'd cowered before chevauchés now saw themselves as guardians of a shared homeland. This seismic shift didn't happen in council chambers or royal decrees. It was earned by every anonymous archer at Agincourt, every burgher defending Rhimes walls, every woman like Jean de Montfort who refused to let war define their limits. The war's greatest legacy wasn't just in redrawn maps, but in the unbreakable spirit it forged. When Charles VII entered retaken Bordeaux that fateful year, he wasn't just reclaiming a city. He was stepping into a world where kings ruled not by divine right alone, but by their ability to unite people under a common cause. The cannon smoke at Castillon signaled the end of medieval warfare's romance, yes, but also the dawn of an era where ordinary people began to see themselves as the true authors of history. The 100 Years' War didn't just create heroes, it created the very idea that heroism could belong to anyone willing to stand for something greater than themselves. These stories of valor aren't just dusty pages in a history book, they're living proof of what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary moments and choose courage. Whether it was Joan of Arc hearing voices no one else could or the Black Prince showing mercy when none was expected, these 25 acts didn't just shape a war, they redefined what it means to be human in the darkest of times. Think about it, a teenage girl rallying an army, a king fighting alongside starving soldiers, a mercenary turning his scars into strategy. These weren't perfect heroes, they were flesh and blood people who stumbled, doubted, and then stood anyway. That's why their legacy still echoes today. When you face your own battles, big or small, remember the lesson these warriors carved into history. That bravery isn't the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. So tell us which of these stories speaks to you, the unshakable faith of Joan, the cunning of du Guesclin, or perhaps the quiet resilience of those nameless archers who changed the world one arrow at a time. Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this journey through the 100 Years' War, hit that subscribe button to keep exploring the past with us. After all, as Froissart knew, great deeds deserve to be remembered not as relics but as beacons, because the next time history calls for heroes, it might just be looking at